All right, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Future Ear Radio Podcast. I am thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Rachel Magann Faivre. Rachel, thank you so much for being here. Why don't we start by having you share a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Really excited to be here as well. So I am an audiologist in Oklahoma City, and I lived in a few different states before moving back here, mostly as a student or extern, though, in those years, and started my career in a nonprofit, building an adult hearing aid program. But almost 3 years ago now, started my own practice, and it is a mobile only or concierge audiology practice. And I travel all over the state and love it. And so that's what I'm doing now. I am from Oklahoma as well originally. Was gone for about 10 years though, before moving back.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for being here. I've been looking forward to this conversation. We met, I think it was at the AAA in St. Louis. So this has been a little bit of a long time coming, but, I just saw you again at the Mobile Audiology Conference, before ADA. And I'm just super fascinated by your whole business because it seems like you've accomplished a lot and kind of built a business pretty quickly, only in the matter of years that you've been up and running. So before we get into all that, I want to start where I always start, which is the whole backstory motivation of how you got into audiology. So do you want to share about what led you to this industry and this line of work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I always start with my mom has hearing loss, significant hearing loss.
Okay.
And so I always knew what an audiologist was because I grew up, going to her appointments at, here and there. But when it came time, so I have a zoology background and was actually going to be a vet. That's what I had went to school for. But I had decided I probably wouldn't be very good at that as far as I'd probably be doing more pro bono than making money at that. And so anyway, so I took a few years off between my undergrad and graduate school. And when looking to go back to school, I knew I wanted to do something in the health field. I was living in Illinois at the time, and the university there, I just went and looked at their PhD and higher, graduate level healthcare related courses. And anyway, the audiology program there just won me over. And I think I'm lucky. I think that it combined two things that at the time I wasn't sure or I didn't know that I would like. But part of it is the healthcare, like helping people, working with community that I love. But there's also the technical component of, working with equipment and fixing things. And I really love hands-on work. And so I think those two kind of components of audiology were a really driving force anyway. So I love being an audiologist, and it's how I kind of fell into being one.
Where did you get your AUD?
Northern Illinois University.
Okay. It seems like there's like a fair amount of people. That must be a pretty popular program because I feel like I've met a good amount of people there. What was, so when you started that track and you started your master's and all that, what was it that really grabbed your attention and your interest? Like clearly you have the personal experience with your mom, but when you actually started to pursue this as your own career, like what really stands out in your mind as that period when you were kind of like being won over?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I've probably always known I like kind of running a business or have that sort of mindset. Even if I didn't really kind of know it in detail back then, but so from the very beginning, like the looking at different programs, the audiology program made more fiscal sense, and not just because of tuition, but they had more avenues for like scholarships and being graduate assistant or research assistant. And so from a business perspective, I was like, well, this makes more sense. I'm not paying tuition and I have a scholarship, right? Or it's very little. But once I had started in the program, the areas that really I really enjoyed, I mean, like a lot of programs, we did a majority of hearing aid, pediatric and adult kind of clinical experience. And so I certainly liked that. But when it came to the specialties, I really loved vestibular, tinnitus, and animal audiology. So
Okay.
those are kind of the three things that when I went to my externship, I kind of was looking for more experience, specialized experience in.
Okay, interesting. So you go to Northern Illinois University, and then where was your externship?
Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota.
Awesome. Okay, and so what was that period like?
Oh my gosh, phenomenal. What an awesome externship and just in general a place to work if you know, for those that are there. We loved our year there. And it was very hard, as you might imagine. It was, you know, your typical 8 to 5 hours. However, I really, especially there, my focus was vestibular, and I was doing some research. But so I was really studying a lot while I was also working because I wanted to get as much information as I could from who at the time Neil Shepard was the director, and you know, he's written textbooks on vestibular audiology. And so I really wanted to learn as much as I could under him and the other vestibular audiologists. But so, gosh, if, you know, I think in another lifetime, we might have stayed and gone that route. But it's a totally different work environment, right? Than,
Mhm.
you know, well, obviously lots of other options you can choose. But it was a great externship site for sure.
That's awesome. Okay, so then this period between starting Ash Audiology and the externship, anything stand out there? Any foundational experience that you sort of gained in that period?
Yeah, so after graduating, well, as a student, I tried to attend pretty much any um, national association, state audiology association, and manufacturer trainings, which, especially at the time, and this may still be the case, there were lots of discounts or at least free opportunities in all those realms. And so I did take advantage of that, trying to meet as many people as I could to make contacts, right? But also just learn. And after graduating, I actually did a 5-month stint with a practice management group. At the time, this doesn't exist anymore, but they had a program where it was intensive learning on best business practices and from leadership qualities and business like ownership and financial pieces. But I got to shadow a few practices around the U.S. through that. So that was a really nice hands-on experience. I was paid, not much, but a little bit. And I also, my last year during my externship year, had applied for ADA's business plan competition, the student business plan competition,
Oh, okay.
which at the time that was the first one they'd done. And so that gave me a ton of foundational knowledge in the business sector because you have to create a business plan, right? And so those would be the kind of learning big experiences, one kind of directed and one self-taught for sure. But after, you know, graduating and after that stint with the practice group, I, like I mentioned, started with a nonprofit that was pediatric and cochlear implant focused. And I came on to create an adult hearing aid practice. It would be very much like starting a typical private practice. And I'm so grateful for that experience, not only because I had lots of wonderful colleagues and it was just a great place to work, but I also had the opportunity to kind of build and grow a practice and really practice all these things I'd learned the last couple of years without it being my wallet on the line, if you will. And but I also loved that experience because I guess 2 reasons. One, I was able to prove to myself what I could do and be successful at it. It was a really low risk way, right, to try something like that out, which I understand that's a unique experience that not everyone can have, right? But it also allowed me, because I was there about 5.5 years, it allowed me to take a step back as well and think, is this the kind of work-life balance I want to be working, right? Or I'm choosing. because the practice grew very quickly and was very successful financially, and we had lots of staff, and so it was really fun and a great learning experience. But for me, coming out of it, I learned I don't think I want to do something that big, at least not be the sole kind of leader of a group like that. Like I have some ideas of what that could look like in the future. But anyway, so it was also a way for me to go big and do these big dreams that I think a lot of students have, when they graduate, but also then being able to step back when I started my private practice and say, do I want to do this again and just build it up again? Or would I like to do it different? So I kind of had a second go, which was also a really valuable kind of life lesson.
So, I'm kind of like thinking already, like, what will the title of this episode be? And I mean, the thing that really stands out here is like just entrepreneurism. And this is an interesting thing for me because like I'm really passionate about this topic, and I feel like it's like audiology is really interesting in the sense that it is actually very entrepreneurial historically because of, it's a medical profession that's primarily private practices, or at least it had historically been. Mm-hmm. And I think that, so you have this like hybrid of kind of the prototypical audiologist that has, maybe they're real clinically oriented, or maybe they're a little bit more business oriented. But I feel like that, what I kind of tend to hear is that there's so much focus on the clinical work that sometimes the entrepreneurism, business elements of things kind of take a back seat. And what's, I guess, discouraging about that is if you don't have that ability to understand business and how exactly to go about becoming an entrepreneur, then you can't maybe fulfill the dream or the vision that you have from a clinical standpoint. So I feel like they really actually go part and parcel. Like you kind of want to have at least somewhat of a background in both. And so what I'm curious, because you had said at the beginning that you've always sort of had this entrepreneurial spirit, but clearly you were doing things that were proactive in how you could sort of foster that, whether it be like the ADA student business plan competition or something like that. So I'm curious in your experience, what are ways that young audiologists or aspiring audiologists can try to like harness that a little bit? And what are resources almost? Because so much of it does have to, it sort of seems like it's, you have to kind of take it upon yourself to go and seek those kinds of things out. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, so I would absolutely agree with what you've just said. My university training, I think we had like a half of a semester with, business principles. So there was no educational aspect as far as like entrepreneurialism or business planning, anything like that. I will say my university professors, though, were very open-minded to any student who just had an interest in any area, even if that area wasn't really supported academically by the program. And so I think, first off, just talking with your university professors and hopefully they have open minds and want to help you foster relationships in those areas that you might have interests in, or at least allow you to go off and pursue those interests. So like I said, in starting, I didn't really know what I was most interested in. I think most students don't know that, kind of what specialties you might like. So my approach, again, was just to attend everything I could and meet everyone I could. That's really hard. Not the going places, at least for me, that was fun, but the meeting people and putting yourself out there, it is hard. And so very early on as a student, when I went to like AAA or ADA conferences, I had my own little student business card, right? This is a little more before when you maybe swap mobile information, right? But when I went to a lecture that I really liked, I made it a pact with myself that every time I went up, stood in line to talk to the speaker, and often I would just say, hey, I really liked what you presented on. I just want to let you know, like I didn't even have anything grand to say or questions to ask. And I just say, here's my business card if you ever, maybe need help in this research area or, whatever the topic was on. And so that at least you have to venture outside your comfort zone, right? I guess is the first thing. Um, but for me and my personality, so the student business plan competition was the first real concrete, I guess, process I went through. And that was very self-taught. I should say my research project. So I did research on telecoils and hearing loops in grad school and in my externship. And I did do more than the required amount for that because, again, I wanted to get as much experience in the research field as I could to see if that was something I wanted to pursue further, like I might like to get a PhD. But the business plan, because it was a project with a deadline and you had to research to, create all the pieces of it, that was a great opportunity. And that this ADA student business plan competition still exists. So that's something students can still do. And so that created kind of a structure, right? Upon graduating and after working, I think I was probably like 3 years into my career, I was itching for more learning, right? Like I'd read a lot of the books that conference like keynote speakers would recommend that often are like motivational or leadership qualities or best business practices, those sorts of things. And they were okay. I mean, they're good, but I'm not a great one to just read something, digest it, and take it. Like I need something a little more practical personally. So I started really looking locally of, was there something I could do in my community that would help foster some of the ideas I had? Because at that point, I felt very confident clinically, right? I'd had a few years experience under my belt. And so I started looking at things like the Rotary Club. I have a really good relationship with my vet for my pets. And so I asked him, hey, do you know any organizations that might be good locally to be a part of? Just generally from like a business perspective. I had a few physicians that I knew personally, and so I reached out to them too. Basically, anyone that was kind of in the general healthcare arena, but kind of by chance, the thing that kind of I guess stuck the most for me locally, we have so through the University of Oklahoma, there was an entrepreneurial kind of leadership building course. A fellowship, if you will. It was a 9-month program. And it was free to the fellows. However, the companies you worked for had to sponsor you. So that was kind of part of the deal. Your company had to say, yes, we want our employee to participate in this program, which I think is just really cool because they're getting buy-in from whatever company that's local, not just the individual, right? And so what appealed to me in this program, other than it was all about learning what I mentioned, leadership qualities, best business practices, but it was all geared around helping the community. And so what the program did was identify a need in the city, and then your group and it was a 5-person group for my group. There were 2 of them in Oklahoma City, so there was 10 of us total on the program in our city. And you go and research how to fix this problem. And so it's very applicable. It's non-audiology. Ours was helping a disenfranchised, primarily Black area of town be able to build individual wealth and training in some fashion. And so the project was fascinating. The 4 other fellows that were on my team were all from different professions. I'm still friends with all of them. I'm friends with a lot of people that were in the program. But that was a way for me to get involved in the community, to feel like I was doing something good, to make contacts outside of audiology, and see another perspective on all those, that training and information. Again, something that was outside of audiology. A lot of it was McKinsey, the consultants, that was kind of their training philosophy. So the leader of this group is called the MINE, M-I-N-E. had been a Mine fellow, had been a McKinsey fellow when he started his career. But anyway, and so that ended up leading me, after I completed that fellowship, the next cohort round that went the next year, I became a team leader for it, because each team has a leader that's already been through the program. And then the third year, so I enjoyed doing that. The third year comes around and I proposed an idea to help underserved populations in Oklahoma for hearing care. And it ended up being one of the projects they chose. And so then there was a whole fellowship year of 5 fellows working on that project for me. And that's, it was no charge sort of thing. It was, obviously time involved. But it just helped everything come full circle to kind of participate in different ways. I certainly, throughout those 3 years, met lots of people in lots of different professions and just communities, right? Like different socioeconomic statuses, and live in different parts of the overall, like, larger metro. And anyway, so locally, I think you've got to find something that is helpful. And so sometimes that can be really simple, like a Rotary Club. But I think the biggest thing you can do is first just ask people that are generally in healthcare, or maybe just successful business people, because they'll also know of these types of resources. And you're probably going to get some duds out of those things that don't really pan out, or aren't as helpful as you might have hoped they would have been. But you learn from that, right? And I certainly did. And then there's also looking at your, and generally I would say these are larger metro areas, downtown areas are going to have, but your universities, your venture capital firms, these are all groups that might host these kind of entrepreneurial programs. And so, just doing a little more research locally to find what could be helpful.
Yeah, there's this meetup in St. Louis that's called Venture Cafe, and the whole idea is that it's in the sort of like the emerging tech entrepreneurial part of St. Louis, and it's open to everybody, and you can just come. And I've gone a few times, and it's just, like, to your point, a really great way to get out of your the current siloed view of the world that you're in, and just kind of meet other people. And so again, just that's just to kind of piggyback on that and say, I think these things actually do kind of exist all over the place. But you said a couple things there that really stood out. So first of all, getting out of your comfort zone, I would say that is probably the best piece of advice for any young person, really anybody, because the best way to grow is to get uncomfortable, and then your comfort zone expands. And I love what you said about how, take it upon yourself to go and tell the lecturer or the person that you saw present that you really enjoyed that. Because look, at the end of the day, 99% of people don't do that. And so it's another way to just kind of stand yourself apart. So I really like all of these as just concrete little things that you can do, because it's all part of a theme, which is you have to be proactive, and you have to understand that the vast, vast majority of people don't do this stuff. So things that might even seem trivial, like having a business card and handing it to a presenter and telling them you really enjoyed their presentation, actually are the kinds of things that set yourself apart in ways that you probably don't even realize, because that presenter might be like, that's really interesting. Who is this person? They look into a little bit, and chances are they're connected, and they're like, hey, I have this audiologist, this young audiologist that took it upon herself to introduce her to me. Didn't you say that you needed somebody in the same metro that you guys exist? So it's a lot of stuff like that where you can never predict the type of serendipity that will probably unfold. So the best thing to do is just give yourself a lot of at-bats, to use a baseball analogy.
Yes. And I know everyone says the audiology world is a small community, and that's kind of a cliched line, but I mean, I agree with it. And there are so many relationships that I met early on that maybe even 5 years later became something, a contact that I actually needed for some sort of, use. And just to even know that those people existed, and to be able to reach out to them has just been super helpful. And so all those people I met early on, there was no goal to start something immediately with them or learn something immediately from them. But a lot of them ended up being very helpful for me down the road.
Yeah, that's awesome. So going back to your story, thank you for entertaining my tangent there about entrepreneurialism, because I just find it fascinating, but it's obviously a huge part of your journey and all that. So you come to the point to where you make the decision that you, like you said, you're part of this nonprofit, you've kind of grown this like division within it for 5 years. Sounds like you were really successful, but you learned through that process of maybe some things you would do differently if you had a second go around. So let's talk about the second go around, Ash Audiology. Just give me a sense of how this thing came to be. What was the motivation behind it? And, what you learned this first time around that maybe you wanted to do differently this with Ash, with your own thing.
Yeah. So I think I've always knew about myself that I probably wasn't meant to work in a like corporation setting, because as a company gets large enough, there become rules, and rightly so, to help the business run smoothly. But those rules don't always make sense for like individual decisions, right? And so, as our company, the nonprofit grew, I think it was a slow progression of just seeing more rules and regulations put in place that made working less fun, right? And so I started thinking about doing my own thing. I mean, not really concretely or in any sort of planning capacity, but to the point where I was like, I know I'm not where I am and where I'm going is not where I want to be, right? And so anyway, so I probably took about a full year of more concrete planning, if you will, and not planning as in like creating documents and a financial plan and that sort of thing, because personally, I liked where I worked. I wanted to do everything I could to leave them in a good spot, right, with my leaving. And I just didn't feel like kind of ethically or morally right planning another business when I was working for one. And so my goal was to take 3 to 6 months off after working there and then plan the next steps. I had general ideas of what that would look like, but the pandemic happened right at the beginning of that, and so that kind of slowed things down. So I probably wouldn't have taken a full year if that hadn't happened. But in the end, the things that I found I didn't like about how I was working was, one, I mean, all of those years I was there, I worked 60, 70-hour weeks. I loved it. It was my choice. It was not the clinic, dictating that. But that wasn't what I wanted to do long term, or not that many hours, especially for a company that wasn't mine, right? I also just learned how to manage people, or how I like to manage people, and the types of kind of flexibility that didn't exist as a company gets larger. There's a lot more flexibility typically with small businesses than larger ones. And so I knew that autonomy and flexibility were two really important aspects to how I enjoy working. And I think that goes back to that kind of entrepreneurial spirit, and just, I love to build. I love to create, and then I get a little bored. And so I love teaching others how to do that, whatever they're interested in, or helping open up doors for them. And so I really enjoy teaching students and just like new hires, and not just audiologists, front office, audiology assistants, all of the hiring. And so when I left, I guess I knew I didn't want to work the hours I was working. I knew that the number of people I managed was something that, in a kind of general term, was building a large business, right? Just on its own, like just our team. And I'm more interested in helping others pursue their dreams, right? And so with my staff, we'd have personal, professional, and financial goal setting, and we'd meet individually quarterly, to discuss those. And so I thought if I'm the owner of a business, how I would see this going. And everyone's goals are very different, right? But I never wanted to be a leader of 15, 20, 30 people. I would much rather find the other people who like to lead and then help them kind of, create their own like wing basically and lead it. So I do like smaller groups. I found that. And yeah, I just wanted, I guess, more control as well in a certain way, but control for how I got to live my life. And so when I started, or when I left, the goal was to plan a pretty typical brick and mortar practice. I looked around at local practices and seeing if any were in the market to be sold. That was my kind of first option or my preferred option. The second option was just starting from scratch. And then the third, which came about and is what ended up happening, is the mobile audiology piece. And really that kind of fell into my lap as a temporary option initially because I had found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after I'd left my job. And so I thought, well, this isn't a good time to open a traditional clinic. So I thought I'll do mobile for like the next year until I'm ready to go back to work after the baby. And then I'll do brick and mortar in the more traditional route. But in that process of doing mobile for those months, I just loved it and never looked back. And so with mobile, there's so many things that are very similar to your, traditional practicing, but so different too, right? And so for me, like the flexibility and autonomy, you just can't beat it. Like there's no more flexible job than a mobile job, I don't think. I love being in people's spaces. So whether it's their home or their office, you really get to see their real world listening environment, right? The second patient I ever had was a physician, and his number one hearing goal was to hear his patients one-on-one in the exam rooms. Well, guess what? I was in his exam room doing his whole evaluation. So I knew exactly what, environment we were looking at. Or one of my patients who lives home alone, and this was down the road. It wasn't an initial visit. She had called upset. Her hearing aids weren't working. So I go out and visit her, and she can't hear her doorbell. And so neighbors and family members are just walking in the door. This has happened for the last few days. And so I'm like, okay, well, we get her hearing aids up and working. She has terrible hearing. One of those patients that, there's only so much you can do. And so I make sure her hearing aids are working fine. Then I start to leave. I was like, wait, let's make sure you can hear your doorbell. So I go and ring it. Well, lo and behold, of course, she didn't tell me this. Her daughter had just installed a Ring doorbell, and it didn't actually ring inside the house. It wasn't set up properly or whatnot. So, had she come into a clinic, got her hearing aids fixed, she still would have gone home and said, gosh, I still can't hear my doorbell and I'm still really frustrated. Where then I could just email her daughter and say, hey, this new doorbell you've installed isn't working. You need to come back. And so problem fixed. So anyway, so there's some real advantages to seeing people in their environment. But to me, it's also fun because it's always changing and different. And, you're always working in like a different space, whether it's an office table, whether it's on a picnic table in an RV park, whether it's the lobby of the dialysis unit. I mean, I've been in all sorts of places doing appointments. And so I really like that aspect as well.
I just think it's so interesting that, it kind of like just also happened to kind of break a certain way where your like first, commercial endeavor that you're doing on your own, at times in such a way where you're pregnant. And so it like sort of forced your hand a little bit in considering this third option, but then you come to really embrace it. And like, for me, the thing that goes through my mind with all of these mobile audiology themed discussions that I've been having is like, you all seem like you've kind of discovered something that other people are just sort of waking up to, which is like, you can do so much of what you've already been doing, but do it on your own terms. And, we look at this industry and it's predominantly a female-oriented industry. I'm sure you're not the only one that's, like the pandemic was a catalyst for a lot of people to consider their whole like work-life balance situation. And so I just feel like this is something that will probably resonate with more females in the audience and males too, but just, the idea of like, you can still be an audiologist, but do it in a way that's more conducive to like becoming a mom and whatever other things might be interesting to you that you don't want to commit to the brick and mortar, like, kind of like pre-existing notion of what a private practice looks like. And it's like, I say all that, and I feel like we're at a point where it sure seems like, I don't have any hard data to support this, but it seems like private practice participation, if you will, or like the young professionals in this industry that are entering in and deciding what they want to do, it seems like it's at the lowest level it's ever been. And part of my thinking is that ideologically, it's not aligned anymore with the wants and needs of the younger generations. And maybe that's just generational. Maybe it's because our generation sees all of these other kinds of, kind of like remote jobs and ways that you can have more balance. But I just look at this and I think, is this maybe the solution to what sure feels like the really low rock bottom private practice pursuit that is underway in this industry? Like, do we need to reinvent what the whole notion of what it means to be a private practitioner in this industry even means anymore?
Yeah, and I think, Dave, an important thing you mentioned there was, at the beginning you mentioned mobile allows you to do a lot of things you've already been doing and know how to do, but on your own terms. So I'll first comment on that my hours are nights, weekends, all through the day. I mean, if you looked at my office hours on the website, it's like 80 hours, or I don't know, however. I do not work all of those hours.
Yeah.
But they're available. And for me, in our lifestyle, evenings and weekends were great. I mean, that worked for our family, right? And so that was kind of working on my terms, right? I think the other thing that's super important is when you do start asking around for maybe advice or information, you're going to get people who tell you that's not a good idea. And so you want to listen to those people as well as the ones that say, yeah, that is a good idea. But I would just say follow your gut and whatever you're really interested in, because you're going to be successful if you're really interested in something, right? Now, you do need to plan and have like a good business model to support what you want to do. So I mentioned animal audiology as an area that I love, right? And when it came time for me to decide what services am I going to provide, am I going to do hearing aids, cochlear implants, vestibular, animals, tinnitus, APD, what's that going to look like? I mean, you do actually have to run the numbers and, what's the demand in your area? What's your reimbursement? What's your desired salary and profit levels? So you do need data to back up your interests. But especially for like what I ended up doing, this mobile audiology, I will say the manufacturers in particular, they can be super helpful for you. Asking just information and help in different areas, but every single one of them told me it was a bad idea to go mobile, and that anyone that did it within a year or two was out of it. And so, it was a lot of negativity, and I'm sure there were a lot of reasons, and, they were well-meaning, but it probably did delay me a little bit in starting whatever I wanted to start because it was so kind of frowned upon. But I think another area is reimbursement for things that aren't your traditional bundled hearing aid model, right? And so all the other specialties are unbundling. It's harder to find support in those areas. But again, if that's where your interest lies and you can do some planning that supports it financially, then the sky's the limit, right? Like you can get in or out of whatever specialty you like, whatever work environment you like, whenever you're your own boss or your own owner. Obviously, there are a lot more responsibilities that you take on and some pieces that you may not like, but the benefits far outweigh those extra responsibilities. And a lot of those responsibilities, if you don't like them, you can outsource them, right? So it just, I just can't say enough of when you follow your dreams and what you're interested in, you're going to be successful.
Um, I just like one of the things I've really appreciated from you when we've talked is that you're really transparent about your process. And I think this is where the rubber really does meet the road between being aspirational and looking at this and thinking, this sounds so exciting. I would love to do that, but where do I even start? Do you want to talk about like how you, like what this process has been like, especially getting off the ground? Because I feel like that once you get the ball rolling, then you can kind of start to figure out on your own. But for me, it seems like where the biggest gap is how do you even get started? So, like what was your planning process like? What went into the calculus of like what services you were going to provide, and ultimately kind of like what led you to your business model, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a planner in that way, and I do probably move a little slower than some folks and am not as much of a risk taker in a lot of ways. I am a data-driven kind of gal in just all aspects of my life. Um, but so the things that I did kind of in the planning process. So first was my general business plan, right? And luckily I had a template because I'd done the ADA business plan competition. So I had a template to work with. But I will tell you, the Small Business Association, SBA.gov, is a phenomenal resource. It's really, if there's one resource I can point people to, it's that one, because it gives you step-by-step instructions of, how to create a business, right? A successful business. And I'm happy to share this information with your listeners as well, your followers. So, outside of a general like written business plan, and that, I was looking at financial planning, that was looking at what services to provide, that was looking at market demographics, staffing requirements. I'm sure I'm forgetting a few other, general topics. I started with just a big Excel sheet on the financial end. I wanted to look at a 3-year projection and have it. So this document has a lot of editable fields in it. And so you can say, okay, I project I'm going to, sell this many hearing aids a month, or I'm going to have this percentage of patients that are Medicare, and this is the, deduction or the reduced reimbursement rate I'm going to get from those particular patients versus my private pay versus my private insurance. This is the percentage of high-end hearing aid versus low-end that I think, I'm going to project I'll sell. Or this is the projected amount of tinnitus evaluations I think I'll have in a year. So all of these like calculations of this is what I think I'll do. And especially if you do have a little work experience, you can have some pretty realistic numbers to put in there, or in theory, some realistic numbers. But even without the real world experience, like I said, I did the business plan as a student, right? And so it can be done as a student as well. And so I think really not only does that give you good financial numbers, but it makes you think about, okay, I need liability insurance. How much does phone and internet cost? What are general like supply startup costs? Like, things from impression materials and
All the oak tree stuff.
yes, exactly. It makes you think through all those steps, right?
Right.
And so financially, you've got to kind of predict that. And what are you going to set your pricing models as? And I think that's a hard one, because I think everyone that at least I've talked to or has reached out to me kind of asking what would their first steps be? They want to know, can they make the money they need to make in this way, right? And so you've got to start at that financial piece, right? And so in setting your prices, you've got to first just figure out, what do you need to make to live? Or what do you want to make to live? Those are different amounts usually. And then you break that down to an hourly or even minute rate. And so I had started out with kind of those big numbers, kind of like I mentioned. I think I'm going to have this many patients, this many sales, this many conversions of whatever type of appointment, right? And there's those numbers. But then you have all the service and like reimbursement. So 92557, what's my audio reimbursement? What is temps and reflexes? What is CI programming? What is, earwax removal? All those things. And so you can get fee schedules from insurances, health insurances. So I did that in my local area. Blue Cross is one of the better reimbursers for those services. And so I got fee schedules and made sure I didn't set any of my service prices lower than what I'd get reimbursed from them. So that was part one of kind of figuring out service costs. Certainly you can look at, if you are practicing in the area that you might have your own practice later, you could kind of look at what are you getting reimbursed or what are you charging there. That can be a helpful just general data point. But starting off with looking at your break-even point plus profit. And so I would encourage people to obviously look up what that means. How do you calculate that? It's very easy. But generally, you just look at what's the salary you want to make plus your expenses for running the business and divide that by how many hours you're going to be working that are billable in a year. So you don't want to just look at 40 hours a week, right? Because you're not typically billing for 40 hours a week. That gives you your general idea of your break-even plus profit value. And then you can add in, different levels. So I had, here's what I need to live. Here's what I'd like to make. Here's if I'm really successful, what's my hourly rate. So with all those services that I mentioned, an audio, temps and reflexes, I said, okay, how long does this generally take, this service? 20 minutes, 2 minutes, And I said, okay, well, my hourly rate is, let's say $200 an hour. Okay, per minute, that equals X. And if this procedure is 5 minutes long, I need to make at least, whatever 5 minutes times my minute rate is. And also not have it lower than what my insurance would reimburse me, right? So that gave me my first general step of setting prices and seeing, is this even feasible? The other thing, and this is a more kind of high level thinking piece, so that what I've mentioned so far, all the financials is very detailed, right? You're going through a lot of numbers. And sometimes that is a little overwhelming at first because it is a large project, right? But I made a decision tree. And that's just simply saying, what are the areas I'm interested in? What are the pros and cons of each of those? And what would I need to do to make those happen? And so I had created a document, and it had, again, like animal audiology. It had hearing aids and tinnitus. It had vestibular. I think it had one or two other items. And, pros and cons are almost like a SWOT analysis too, like a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, right? Okay, this particular specialty there's no one doing it in my market, or there's a lot of people doing it, or I really love this one. This is my favorite. This is my least favorite. And anyway, and so that really helped me at least figure out a place to start, and what services I would start with, and what kind of practice I wanted to have, right? Because like in my instance, I mentioned I'd love vestibular. That's not so easy to do mobile. And so that kind of got ruled out when I went mobile, right? So you may find things that just, don't end up fitting your model, even if you really like that area, right? And so that was their kind of concrete piece, I guess, that was helpful. And the market analysis piece, that's another high level. It's helpful information, but I wouldn't let it dictate your decisions too much, like looking at your demographics of, okay, this zip code has this average income, or this zip code has this age group, right? Because, those are helpful data points in knowing maybe where you might want to practice, or where competitors are located, or where maybe specialties are located, but not an audiologist. It's certainly helpful, but I wouldn't spend a ton of time on those general like city demographics. I think I spent probably more time on that than really was useful in the end. So that might be a piece I would, I guess, recommend. And then, I think gathering costs, because you do have some fixed costs to start with, right? You've got to buy equipment. Even if you're not mobile, you've got to take into consideration rent, utilities, insurance, all that stuff. And so you looking at all that, it just becomes a more realistic vision. And that's all things you can kind of do on the side in your free time if you want. Like I said, I did mine kind of after I left because I planned to take a little time off to really devote to planning what I wanted to do next. But you could do those things while you're working too. I know not everyone has that luxury to take some time off. And so I guess those would be the things I'm thinking of immediately that I worked on. I guess one other resource I'll mention, since I mentioned the SBA, that I really liked was the Lemonade Accounting Stand book. It's a very like Charlie Brown level accounting book with pictures, but it makes it very, and I like numbers, don't get me wrong, I'm not like averse to numbers, but I didn't know anything about accounting, right? So that was one of the foundational books for me early on, like as a student, that helped me like figure out how to calculate, just different things that you need in that area. So that I might recommend that for folks too.
These have all just been fantastic suggestions and real concrete, tangible suggestions that people look into. I love the decision tree and the whole spreadsheet. I think that's got to be the very first place you start if you are going to go and pursue your own business. Is you have to make sure that you're setting realistic expectations. And so I think that the planning piece, like you're an expert in. If you haven't already, you probably are already in the process of building a consulting company here, because I'm sure there's a lot of people that would love to spend hours with you really, working through this stuff. But I guess then the other question, kind of like the yin to the yang here is, okay, so you planned all that, but then like when you start to go to execute and you're actually going to market, I'm just like so fixated on this. Like, how do you get your first customer? Where do you start? Like, what's day one? Like, okay, you put your metaphorical for sale sign on, and it's like, okay, doors are open. I'm open for business. Where do you start?
Yeah. So for me, I started with a website and Facebook, like a calendar posts before I really put my name out there, just so that it looked legitimate when people, did find me in whatever avenue, they could see me online as well. So those were my, I guess, first two steps in having a really nice presence. At least I hope it's a nice presence online. And having like a professional logo and branding. You've got to look really good and professional. Don't start like you're just selling hearing aids out of the back of the trunk, right?
Which I think is like easier than ever. Like you can use something like Canva and you can make a really nice looking logo, and and again, like a lot of I don't know, there's just a lot of easy to use tools that were things that were like historically perceived as barriers of entry, like how do I even make a logo, are a lot easier to do today. So there are a lot of like tools out there that are really easy to use.
Yeah. And again, this is me kind of going back to like being a slow starter. I guess two things that were important to me is when I did need help, I wanted to use local sources as much as possible because I like to support my community and small businesses. And so that was difficult to find things like who would my accountant be, or who is the lawyer that's going to look over like my HIPAA policies and just different paperwork in that realm. And those were very tough areas to kind of focus on. But I think when you're and like I said, so I'm pretty slow at that, and I think a lot of people would not create everything on their own, right? Like outsource some of the things, creating a logo or your first letter to a physician. But once I had kind of my online presence set up, first I just, on my personal social media platforms, just said, hey, I've opened a business, right? So at least all my local contacts knew this is what I was doing, totally. Right? So a big one. My first goal was to market to physicians. So in a traditional marketing sense, I was not going direct to consumer by any means. I still don't. I still think physicians are the best way to build your community. And for me, literally, that was one letter that was done by a local printer that helped, design it and make it pretty. I mean, I created the content in it, and it was all, medical information and just kind of a general overview of services we provided and insurances we took and that sort of thing. So that's where I got my foot in the door. And specifically with physicians, so I looked at primary care physicians first, and I picked a certain radius. So I picked within an hour's drive of where I was, which in Oklahoma, that's a pretty big radius. But that was kind of where I wanted to start, if you will. And I also focused heavily on the physician practices, those family medicine practices that had a similar model as mine. So I found out and just research. I mean, I literally just was Googling primary care physician and, checking out every single website. How many physicians are in this practice? I found out there was a mobile primary care physician group. And so I was like, oh, well, this is perfect. I need to reach out to them. There's also a group, this is more nationally, that might be helpful for people everywhere, MD VIPs. That's a certification or a title, if you will. And they primarily serve self-pay patients. Some take insurance, but most of them don't. And most of them, it's, you pay a fee for a year of services and, X, Y, and Z is included in that. So it's kind of a bundled model. So they're looking at a patient demographic that was similar to what I would like to start with, right? Plus, most of them are private practice physicians as well. So they want to also help other private practice healthcare providers because that's, they're in the same field, I guess. So those two pieces. And then I also, again, in my primary care looking, found there were a few physician groups that were not MD VIP, but they were still that self-pay model. And that attracted a lot of folks who didn't have insurance or whose premiums were so high, it was just cheaper to pay out of pocket. And so that's like a very middle class, at least in my area, as in my experience of who's come to me from those practices, a very middle class kind of market. And so that is where I started to get people. And honestly, between physicians and then just word of mouth, your community, right? And not just your family or whoever you live near. That's why it's so important to get involved in things like Rotary Club or like I did this Mind program because I had contacts in lots of different areas. So my reach was further, So that's really where it started and how I got my first patients in the door.
And there's probably a Rotary Club in like every single city, I think, right? So
I think so.
That's a pretty applicable one. But I mean, again, I just love that you're being so open about all this because this scratches the itch I have. And I hope that there are people listening that like, this is really enlightening to hear, okay, so that's how you go about doing it. And it makes sense too. I mean, okay, I've referenced this a bunch of times before, but like I think it was Hearing Health That Matters, put out a survey that surveyed audiologists asking about their patient acquisition. And like, number one, word of mouth referrals. Number two, physician referrals. So it seems like, there's just, you can do yourself a tremendous benefit by building inroads with the medical community around you because they're going to send people your way. But I love what you said too about these different services and these groups that can help to like get you in with different sets of patients and all that. Because it might be daunting if you are trying to go direct to consumer. Like there's definitely an element of that. And some of the word of mouth stuff would, I guess, apply to that. But it seems like there's some more tactical ways that you can kind of get something off the ground. And then obviously, as you get the ball rolling, it starts to compound on itself, like even more word of mouth marketing.
Yes, exactly. And you can start adding in extra, outreach, I guess, if you will. So I think the thing that I started, it was probably a year into the practice. I started reaching out to senior living communities, just a handful, because I wanted to start really small to work out the kinks, basically. And that's been really just really fun for me. A different type of seeing patients. I have almost a different model, not from a service perspective, but from a financial model, because those folks don't carry wallets on them, and most of them don't even or a lot of them don't have full control over their finances. So you're talking with, children or, other family members regarding that. So it's a totally different model than just going to someone's house. But it, it opens other areas, because once you get comfortable, I would just say choose one specific thing that's probably the most comfortable to you and that you're confident in, and that the numbers support, your data and your research supports. Don't feel like you have to do all of, like, I want to do these 5 things. I need to, I have to get physicians. I need to, contact potential patients. I need to contact senior living communities. You don't need to do all that. Like, do one thing and then step by step add on when you can and when you have time, because one, it's just a lot less stressful, right? And
Yeah.
less overwhelming. But I think it's also just feasible and works better that way as well.
Totally. So as we come to the close here, I could go for another hour here just asking you questions, but I don't want to take too much of your time. So what I am curious about is, what does, we're only in February, so what does the remainder of 2023 look like for you? What are the goals for Ash Audiology kind of moving forward now that you've got your feet underneath you, it sounds like, and like you said, you're kind of like incrementally adding different elements of your business. So what's sort of the current phase, and then where do you want to go from here?
Yeah. So, gosh, I pretty much in every step from starting to now, I've been in a really comfortable position. I've not felt like I was totally overwhelmed by the amount of work I had, but I also didn't feel like, oh my gosh, I'm not making enough, or I'm not seeing enough people. And that's a just really liberating feeling in general, to have that kind of mindset, if you will, and flexibility, right? And so for 2023, correct. So I've got a pretty good, just, general home and office visit kind of clientele, right? Your individual patient. And then a few living communities that are enough for me right now. Not really looking for growth. I'm actually expecting baby number 2 in a few months. And
Congrats.
so that's going to take, obviously, a big chunk of my time and energy. Adjusting to that and that change in life. So I honestly don't have big goals professionally because of what I have going on personally. Last year I had lots of professional goals, right? Because I didn't have big changes personally. But again, that's the beauty of, I think,
Right.
practice the way you want, is you can be so flexible about your life. And I guarantee you, come 2024, I'll be back in that realm of, okay, what's next? What can we do? So I mean, a big goal for me, I will say a little bit more longer term, is getting into APD. It's another specialty I'm interested in that I think will work really well with my model. But also, I've always wanted to help underserved communities, and I've been doing that. But getting into that community has been very tough, and there's not a lot of resources of how do you do this well. And so that's another area I'd still like to continue to grow in what we're doing.
That's awesome. And I love that too. Like, you can kind of oscillate between your focus on professional development or personal life. And again, I think that's kind of like this whole conversation in a nutshell, is that you've given yourself the ability to be in a position like that, which I think will probably resonate with a lot of people. I think that's kind of one of the best parts about this whole thing, is like that work-life balance. So Rachel, this has been an absolutely awesome episode. Really cool conversation. I've really enjoyed getting to know you and learn about your business. And I can't wait to see what you do from here. So I'm really appreciative of you coming on the show today.
Oh, you're so sweet, Dave. It's really been my pleasure. This is a lot of fun on my end too. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, thanks everybody who tuned in here to the end, and we will chat with you next time. Cheers.